The first duty of any government is the defence of the nation. In our country, the defence of the realm, the protection of our borders. Try and imagine, if you will, a situation where your country has been subjected in the last decade or so to about 8,000 rocket attacks and about 700 suicide bombers. They've come across your borders. Any country which had been subjected to such acts of war would of course be entitled to defend itself and to take appropriate measures to do so. For example, if the rockets were coming across borders or the suicide bombers were coming into the country through a land border, closing off that border and establishing, for example, a sea blockade. You can't have rockets raining down on your cities. You can't have suicide bombers unleashing their evil in buses and trains and cinemas and so on. No country can accept that. Every country is entitled to defend itself, and that is guaranteed under international law. As we know, Israel has imposed a naval blockade on the Palestinian territory of Gaza. Gaza is being governed by a Hamas, that is an organisation which is designated a terrorist organisation by many countries. And the Hamas government has not observed the requirements of Israel in relation to stopping rockets coming into its territory and suicide bombers entering its territory. Israel has imposed a naval blockade. Egypt, an Arab country, has imposed a land blockade on her border so that Gaza is isolated. This has imposed, of course, harshness on the civilian population, but it seems that they are getting sufficient humanitarian supplies and Israel is allowing those to come in. Now, what was recently established was a flotilla of 6 ships led by the Mare Marmara, the motor vessel Mare Marmara, which had been purchased by IHH. Now, IHH is an Istanbul established so-called charity, although when years ago the Turkish police raided their headquarters, they found bombs and explosives and evidence that IHH was sending off suicide bombers to various conflicts around the world and was associated with international terrorist organizations. Now, from its foundation as a secular republic under Kemal Ataturk, Turkey has been disinclined to be involved with the more extreme parts, extreme angles of Islamicization. But under the government of Erdogan, Premier Erdogan, there's been a change. And Premier Erdogan seems to have tolerated the activities of IHH, particularly in bringing together this flotilla, which was to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza. Now, this obviously was designed to break the blockade so that Israel could not impose the blockade again. As the ships approached the forbidden area on the high seas, which are entitled to impose a blockade, of course, outside of the territory affected, as the ships approached the blockade, Israel called on them to go off to the Israeli port of Ashdod, with a guarantee that all of the humanitarian cargo would be taken into Gaza. The lead ship the Mari Marmara, under the control of IHH, refused and said, we are going to Gaza. The Israelis then took the action necessary to take over all of the ships, which happened peacefully in relation to the 5 ships where there were fellow travellers, good people no doubt, well-intentioned people, wanting to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, but also wanting to break the blockade. But when it came to the Mari Marmara, when the soldiers landed on the ship from helicopters, armed only with paintball guns, or holding paintball guns, but having sidearms, they were attacked. They were attacked with iron bars, with knives, and they were shot at. Whether this was from weapons seized from the Israeli soldiers or not, we don't know. We don't as yet know. And at least one Israeli soldier was thrown overboard and others were injured. The Israeli commandos then sought permission to use their weapons and to use live ammunition. They, after all, had to protect themselves. They were in danger of being killed, and if you saw the videos, you'd see how ruthlessly and viciously those on the ship were acting. They weren't peaceful humanitarian activists, it seems, and the Israelis retaliated as they had to. The ship was taken under control within about half an hour, and the ships were taken to Ashdod, and the cargoes registered, and those on the ships deported from Israel. Now, this was a perfectly proper and reasonable action by the Israeli government. They had no alternative but to retaliate when their soldiers were attacked. This has led to the most unusual outpourings, even by friendly Western governments, some of whom have decided to call on the lifting of the blockade, including our own government, the government of Australia. The Prime Minister's called for the lifting of the blockade. What, you may ask, would Mr. Rudd do if rockets were raining down on our cities and suicide bombers unleashed on our public transport, in our cinemas and hotels? What would he do? Would he take action to isolate the territory where these were coming from?